Forms in XHTML and HTML are how you provide interaction between a user and a web server. And so they look like this. You have places where you can type things, you have buttons that you can press, and you have more places you can type things and more buttons you can press. And there are different types of elements in the form, and these are called widgets. And so you can type text into a text widget. You can press radio buttons, and radio buttons are the kinds of buttons that are mutually exclusive. In other words, I can only press one radio button at a time in a group of radio buttons, and they're grouped together so that you can have one choice out of several. Checkboxes are widgets that you can check and uncheck at will, and they do not group together, so you can always check as many or as few as you like. And then this is a submit button, so when I click on this button, it'll actually submit this data to the server, and then a program on the server takes over and does whatever it's supposed to do with the data from the form. So there's a couple of things to understand here. The most important is that this is a two-part process. There's a front end and there's a back end. The front end is the XHTML or HTML that creates the form. And we have that here in this text editor here so that you can see how to create these widgets. And this course is about the front end. The back end is what the server does with the data once you submit it to the server. The back end is usually written in a programming language like Perl or PHP or something else. And it accepts the data from the web browser, from the form that the user has filled out on the web browser, using a protocol called CGI. CGI stands for Common Gateway Interface, and it's simply the very small, very simple specification of how the browser talks to the server and passes back and forth this information that's in the form. So this is about the front end. Now, obviously the form is no good without some kind of a back end. And you need to understand that the process of installing a script on the back end is something that varies from server to server. I can give you the script, but I can't necessarily tell you how it installs on your server. The scripts that I have provided in the exercise files are written in Perl, and I have a separate course on lynda.com about how to install Perl scripts on a server. And again, because all servers are different, it doesn't cover all possible situations, but it covers a lot of them. And if you're interested in how to do that, you can take a look at that course using Perl with CGI, I believe it's called, and that'll teach you how to do that. In the meantime, for the purpose of testing your form, I have installed a small script on my server, and all it does is it gives you back exactly what you put into the form so that you can experiment with your form fields and you can at least design a form and follow along in this lesson. And so I'm just going to go ahead and here and click on send, and you'll see what that does. It just echoes back what you typed in the form fields and gives you some other information that probably doesn't mean a whole lot, but in the context of the server it does. And so that is there so that you can follow along in this lesson. I've included that script in the exercise files, and I've also included a mail form script in the exercise files, which if you have somebody who knows how to install such things, you can install that on your server and use this form to actually send feedback to a given email address that you provide in the form. I'll talk a little bit about the CGI programs in the next lesson in this chapter, but this chapter is really about the front end. It's about how to do the forms in XHTML and HTML. So let's take a quick look at the form here and what it does and how it works. This is the form in XHTML, and it starts here with the form tag, and the form tag has a couple of attributes. It has a method attribute and it has an action attribute. These are required. Method equals post. There's two choices here. There's get and post, and we'll talk about those in a minute. And the action attribute gives the location of the CGI script on your server in a URL. In this case, it's my server, bw.org is my server, and it's this test.cgi. And again, you're welcome to use that just for the purpose of following along in this lesson. Then we have the form elements. The form elements are typically like this in an input tag. There's a few exceptions, and we'll see that. The input tag here, in this case it's type equals text, and that makes a text field. So we have here this little text box, one line of text, and that is done with this input type equals text and name equals name. And we'll talk in a moment about what this name attribute does. And so here's another text box. We'll scroll down here a little bit, and here is our radio buttons. So we have input type equals radio, name equals retail, value equals consumer, and checked equals checked. And then here's another radio button, input type equals radio, name equals retail, value equals store. And so you'll notice that this one here says checked equals checked, and all that means is that that's the button that is selected by default. And this name equals retail, you'll see we use the same name in both of the radio buttons. That's how they group together. And so you can only have one radio button selected at a time in a given group. And the group is defined by having the same name. So if they have the same name, only one of them at a time is going to be allowed to be selected. And so we'll look at this in the browser. And here we have these two. Now I'm going to reset this form. If I just press reload, it doesn't actually reset the form. It'll reload the HTML and it'll show any changes here, but the data remains the same. So if I want to actually reload the form and reset it to its default positions, I actually have to go up into the location bar and select it and press the Enter key on my keyboard, which I'm going to do right here. And that actually resets the form to its default state. Different browsers work a little bit differently, but most of them require something like that in order to reset a form. So now it's in its reset state, and you'll see that the consumer button is pressed because I have this checked attribute here. If I take that out and save it, and then I'll reset the form again by going up to the title bar and pressing Enter. Now you see that neither of the buttons are pressed. I need to press one. I don't have to. I could press neither of them. This is the only way to get neither of them to be selected. If I now select one or select the other one, there's now no other way I can click outside of it. It doesn't unselect it. There's no other way to get none of them to be selected. But there's always going to be one at this point and no more than one. So I'm going to go ahead and put that checked back in here and save. And we'll go back and reset. And there we are. Now moving on, here's the checkboxes. And again, if I want to make one of these checked by default, I can use that checked equals checked syntax. Here, each of them has a separate name, you'll notice. The name attribute is different in each one of them. And you'll see that the type equals checkbox, and that's what makes them checkboxes like here. You'll see also that the text that's related to both the radio buttons and the checkboxes is separate. It's outside of the form element. It's done in the HTML. And so I have the word consumer here before the radio button for consumer. I have the word retail store here before the retail store. And all of these input elements are inline level elements. And so they go right in there with the text and they just flow just like the text. And so that's how that works. I just want to show you, if I put in here checked equals checked, you'll see that now this hobbyist checkbox will be selected by default. And I'll go back here to the browser and I'm going to reset the form by selecting the location bar and pressing the Enter key. And you'll see now that hobbyist is checked by default. I can uncheck it if I want to, and I can check something else if I want to, but it's checked by default because I had that checked equals checked default in there in the XHTML. So I'll go ahead and take that out and save. And we'll move along here. We have another text box here, input type equals text. And then we have one called text area, and that's right here. Text area is a container, and it creates this text area here, which you can type a lot of stuff into. You can type a lot of stuff in here. And if I just copy and paste that, you'll see that eventually it gets a scroll bar after it fills up for a while. So you can actually put a lot of stuff in a text area. The dimensions of the text area are specified here with cols equals 30 and rows equal 5. You can do different things with it in CSS if you like. The contents of the container here, you notice it has a begin tag and an end tag, is the default value. So if I put in here, this is the default for the text area, and I click Save, and then I go in here and reset the form by selecting the location bar and pressing Enter. You'll see that now I get the default value in the text area. And so that can be useful if you want it to default to something. We'll go ahead and take that out for now and save. Finally, on this page, you'll see we have this button which submits the form. It's the send button down there at the bottom. And this is type equals image. So type equals image acts like a submit button. Instead, you can say type equals submit, and I'll click Save here. And instead of this image here, we will get a submit button, a normal submit button as we would see in our operating system. So I'm just going to press reload, and we'll see that the image now changes to this submit button that says submit query. That's the default text for that. You can change that with a value attribute. You can have it say value equals label goes here. And if I save that, then the button will say label goes here when I reload. See, label goes here. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back the way that it was. And that's how you create a normal submit button. Most people prefer the image buttons instead, so they can create their own image. They can create their own button. Most people prefer to do it that way. You can even do things like creating rollovers using CSS, and a lot of people like to do that. Those are the major elements available in a form. Those are the major form widgets available.